year after year, the number of folks who were shot in Philadelphia continued to increase. In the last couple of years, we saw a slight dip, but we have not yet gone down to levels below 2001. And it's quite possible this year, given what we're seeing at our hospital. Yesterday, in the last 48 hours, we've had 2 different women who were shot and brought to our hospital. And the rate is climbing steadily. But it's easy to see why it is, in fact, an epidemic, why it is a public health crisis. This is a war. When I came to Temple back in 2005, it had followed a really tough year in Philadelphia. I knew something had changed. I'm sure if you were living in Philadelphia, you sensed something was changing. Suddenly you started seeing children and fathers and mothers and even grandmothers wearing Stop Snitching shirts. Stop snitching. Don't cooperate. Don't tell what you saw. Allow lawlessness to capture our communities. And I felt that we were losing our spirit, we were losing our soul in the city that I love so much. In February of 2004, a young man, Fahim Thomas Childs, was killed on his way to school. I think I told this story last year. As Fahim began to enter the school, 2 groups of young men decided to have a shootout just at the time kids were going into class. And within seconds, 90 rounds of ammunition had been fired at a school where children were going to do the thing that they should be doing, going to learn. None of the co-combatants struck one another. The only 2 people who were struck in the shootout were Fahim and a school crossing guard who was shot in her ankle. The police brought Fahim to our hospital. They carried him in, and you can ask the nurses who were there. They'll tell you that the police officer, this big, hulking man who carried Fahim like a child, which he was in tears. He had to be consoled. This man had seen all kinds of things, but when we got to the point where you're shooting 10-year-old kids, something is wrong. We've lost our minds. The nurses will tell you that they still have a hard time talking about that day because they didn't know who Fahim was, because at 10 you don't have a driver's license. So as they poured through his backpack looking to see if there was any indication of who this little boy was with a single bullet wound to his head, they found a Valentine's Day card, because this was February 11th. It was 3 days before Valentine's Day, and the only thing they could find with his name on it was a card that said, "Happy Valentine's Day, Mommy. I love you, Fahim." I still get a little choked up talking about that, because that's a 10-year-old boy in a city, and if we can't protect our 10-year-old children, who can we protect? What good are we? There was a lot of outrage that occurred at that time. You know, Philadelphians did what we were so good at doing. When you confront us with something like this, what do? We get up and we march, we walk. That was our response. You killed one of our 10-year-old kids, and we put on comfortable pants and strapped on some sensible shoes, and we marched. I'm not even sure where we were going or what we planned on doing, but we said, hey, you kill our kids, and we're going to stretch our legs in your neighborhood and write a catchy catchphrase, and then we're going to get in our cars and drive back to our safer neighborhoods. And that's what we did. In the wake of Fahim's shooting, even famous people came out to walk. Bill Cosby, Will Smith. We didn't actually walk on the day that we had initially set up to walk because it rained that day, and if you know anything about us, we don't like to get our outrage wet. So we had to postpone our march to when it was this would have been a good day to march. You know, but it had to be sunnier for us to march. In the wake of these types of things, when we have such a lackluster response, when we have such a weak response, it's easy to understand why kids give up hope. After Fahim's death, we started asking questions. What are kids in Philadelphia experiencing? What are kids like Fahim going through before they meet their maker? More importantly, these young men, teenagers who picked up handguns and thought it made sense to work out their differences in front of a school, what was their life like? And they started looking at data from kids who had grown up in North Philly, kids who had been born not far from where Fahim had been raised, to get a sense of what they experienced. And I think I did this last time, but I just, in case you weren't here, I want to get a show of hands. How many of you regularly heard gunshots at age 7 outside your home? Yeah. They asked these kids in North Philly how many of them had heard gunshots. 75% of them had heard gunshots regularly. How many of you worried at age 7 that you might be murdered, that might be the way you meet your maker? Again, 61% of these 7-year-olds, that's what they worried about. This next one breaks my heart. 1 in 5 of them sometimes wish they were dead. My daughter, the greatest stress that she has in her life, and she's 8, is she worries about whether or not Taylor Swift and one of the Jonas Brothers are going to reconnect, because there would go her dreams for marriage. It's the greatest stress my daughter has. I would hate to think that she'd sometimes wish that she were dead, because life is so tough. Again, 1 in 5, nearly 1 in 5 had seen a dead body outside the house. How many of you at age 7 regularly saw dead bodies outside your house? And I don't want to get too personal, but if we are going to get personal, this seems like a good place to do it. How many of you had seen somebody shot or stabbed inside your home? 1 in 10 of the 7-year-olds that they interviewed had seen somebody shot and stabbed inside their home. They started looking at, well, where are these kids living in Philadelphia? If you look at the red part of the map, that's where the highest concentration of youth are, age 18 and under. They're right there, right around Temple. If you take that same area of concentration for young kids age 18 and overlay it where the shootings are happening, you can see that those kids are exposed to a tremendous amount of violence. And if you also take that same area where the highest concentration of kids are and overlay it where the greatest number of drug corners are, or at least the top drug corners in Philadelphia, as reported by the Philadelphia Weekly newspaper, you can see that they are exposed to something even scarier. Again, these kids are enlisted in the unholiest of wars. You can ask kids to give back to their communities. You've got to give back to your communities. Guess what? They are. They're giving back exactly what these communities have given them. They're living in communities that have brutalized them, and they're going to return the same. They've been raised on a steady diet of hopelessness, anger, hurt, and hunger. And that's all they know. They're going to give back exactly the same. You know, there's a rapper, Talib Kweli, who has this verse that I'm so fond of because I think it captures what these kids are feeling. He says, "You look in the skies for God, what you see besides the smog or broken dreams flying away on the wings of the obscene. Thoughts that people put in the air, places where you get murdered over a glare, but everything is fair. It's a paradox we call reality, but keeping it real will make you a casualty of abnormal normality. Killers born naturally like Mickey and Mallory, not knowing the ways will get you capped, like an NBA salary." I mean, that's kind of the hopelessness that a lot of these kids are feeling. We've abandoned them on a concrete island, like in the book, The Lord of the Flies, and we've allowed them to write their own social codes, and this is what they're doing in the absence of fathers, in the absence of men. These kids are coming up with their own rules. If there's no better purpose for us as men who are looking in the mirror to say we need to go back there, it is that. I cannot stress, and I know you understand the importance of men and the connection to young people. At my program, when I bring kids in, one of the first things I do is I ask kids to tell me, who is it that you'd be willing to die for? Who do you care enough about? Who do you love enough that you'd be willing to die for them? And some of them will raise their hands. They'll say my mom or my grandma. Sometimes it's my sister or my little cousin. Do you know who they almost never say? Their fathers. And when I push them to tell me why it is that they never mention their fathers, they say, I don't know my father. I don't know. And in the case that they do know their fathers, they have such a bad relationship that's the last thing that they'd be willing to do is to die for their fathers. We have to stress to young people what is important, help them recalibrate the difference between what's important and what's not. We have to be willing to have the courage to talk to them about the difference between thugs